Okay, guys, it's time to make another video on narcissists, and I'm naming this one Narcissist, the Devil's Got Their Mind. One of the things I always said about these kind of people, or at least one category of the narcissist, that I said for decades before I learned about the narcissism explosion, I always said the devil's got their mind because you could tell that they were pretty much completely lost because for lack of a clearer definition, the devil had their mind. It's clearly they had given their mind over to the devil to such a degree. And I don't think that's just a superstition. I think this is something that spiritually does happen, that a person can give themselves over to darkness and bad spirits to the point where they've lost their mind, they've lost parts of their mind and their ability to see right. And so, among the internet giving many definitions of narcissism to try to help everyone kind of get a grasp of what's going on and recognize it better, this is one of my little inputs. As you may have seen on my other videos, I have the theory that the narcissist is usually doing one of two things. They're either they deliberately fantasize all of the time, that's their habit. They deliberately walk in a fantasy world, they have pet fantasy, and of course the psychologists have a definition that matches this. They either have a deliberate fantasy world, or somehow or other they can't see the world clearly. They can't see the way things really are to such a degree that becomes like a fantasy. Their way of seeing the world is actually a none of us see the world perfectly. We all have filters. We all have ideas that may not match other people's ideas, and we may learn over time to change our ideas to match reality, the reality that we are actually walking in. But the narcissist is usually twisted by false ideas. Their vision is twisted by extreme selfishness, refusing to see reality, refusing to see other people's point of view. And it's not like you have to change your beliefs to match everyone else's belief, as much as when it comes to the common decent things of doing to others, have compassion, the narcissist type person seems to lack a lot of that in some areas. So either way is what I call fantasizing. But there's a deliberate fantasy, or there is a type of non-reality that may as well be a fantasy. It is their form of fantasy. And in both scenarios, they're walking in darkness. They cannot be realistic, and they cannot be flexible in reality, in the real world where you are. They can't be flexible. They can't be realistic. And there, of course, we all know there's all sorts of kinds of narcissists, but this is some main things that we can see that characterize them. And they've usually developed a certain way of having their relationships. When it comes to relationships with other people, especially the personal relationship, they are very self-serving. It always supports their fantasy, even though the victim doesn't see it. Their relationship is supporting their fantasy. That's why they love bomb you and they worship you. It's not because, which as you know, if you've listened to my channel, I don't promote worshiping another person. But the way these people love and love bomb at the beginning, this is like a love bomb of the person that they love at the beginning. And it may be a lover, or it may be just a friendship. But it's an abundance of love and support and attention, or whatever the person wants to thinks that you want. You're just showered with it. Has nothing to do with you, has everything to do with their fantasy, which is usually about themselves. They're not giving you all this attention. They're in a indirect way giving themselves. They're giving their supply that kind of attention. And in their way of having a relationship, okay, they're very self-serving. Their relationships support their fantasy, and it feeds their dark addictions. Because if you've listened to my channel much, you know that one of my theories here is that they're fantasy based and they're addiction based, and that combination is what gets the person stuck into the cycle of narcissism. They're usually very, very addicted to one, many, or several things from a young age. They're addicted to what the Bible would say, lust of the flesh, lust of the mind. But their relationships always feed that. So be careful if you're entering into a relationship where you are feeding someone's illegal, inappropriate lust. That's just one more key that you're being completely used in a wrong way to support someone else's illness and sickness. And another key element of their type of relationship is it will fool the victim into believing that they are in a genuine relationship. And that's the mirroring aspect. Unless you're really looking for it, you won't see the signs that they're living in a fantasy. You'll just think it's all about you. They've learned how to make eye contact and pay attention to certain key things that you're saying. So it doesn't seem like they're in another world, but they are. And so another thing about their relationships is they're one-sided all the time. Of course, you would never see this. If you're the victim, you don't realize how one-sided it is until later. And before I go on, I wanted to share a story of a family friend. This is a good example of one person in my life who gave me this idea of the devil's got their mind. This is one. There's several. I would say at least a dozen people who I've encountered where I've thought, wow, they're just completely gone. The devil's got their mind. But narcissism may not go this far as what I'm about to explain to you in every case, but you can understand what I mean when I tell the story. That a narcissist you encounter may have a form of this to some degree or other. Our family friend would come over for visits, like during holidays sometimes, and he was a little bit older than some of the family, but he would have the problem of thinking in his own mind, in his own world, from time to time. This would happen over the space of, I would say, about 15 years. So every few years he would have the idea that he had a relationship with one of the girls in the family. And he didn't act too inappropriately toward the person. He would just be kind of friendly and over friendly, and he would have a normal interaction with all the family. We were nice to him because he was like a family friend, a church friend, and we knew his whole family at church and things. So, but then it showed up out of the blue, like when one of the family members when one of my female family members announced to everyone in the room something to do with her new boyfriend, he stormed out of the room like he was very angry. And then whenever we would check on him to say, what's wrong? My goodness, did you were you having chest pains, or, did you get some bad news? Like, what happened? He would act like, oh, I'm sorry, it was just a fluke. And something just I just thought of something, but it's okay now. And he would act like everything was fine now. But we started picking up that he apparently thought he was in a relationship with this woman or that woman until they announced their boyfriend or explained that they were in a relationship with someone, and he caught word of it. Then he would act angry or jealous, and it was completely inappropriate because there was no understanding between him and this other woman that they were in any kind of relationship. So he was totally fantasy based, and it was strange. But one of the things he would do is, while the rest of the family was sitting around watching television, playing board games, eating, having conversation or whatever, he would sit in the corner and just space out. And it was strange because he would come over to visit the family for the holidays, and he would sit in the corner and not even looking at the TV or anything. He just wouldn't be there. And sometimes his face would like get really red, but he would just sit there and he wasn't there, and we would all talk and talk, and he would just sit there. And then when it was time, he decided it was time to go, he would leave. And so that's another thing where I suspected that he was lost, like in a fantasy world. I think narcissists live that way. I believe they do. And that the devil works on each person individually if they're giving themselves over to a devil. And a lot of times we need to recognize that the spiritual world is going on with all of us all the time. And the extreme example I just gave you of this family friend was sadly a situation where the devil had worked for many years and had taken over a lot of his mind in a specific kind of way. But this would be, like I said before, an example for you to think about of this is what's happened to these narcissists, is the devil has taken over their mind to a certain degree, to a certain amount, in a certain particular way. It's something to keep in mind. That way, when you start putting the pieces together with someone, you can look back into their history or any relationships that you know about in their life or their lifestyle patterns, and you can piece together of, yes, they were consistently either daydreaming or just caught up in certain kinds of strange, unhealthy unrealities, and you can see where the enemy has taken over their mind and entrapped them in either addictions or something similar. And my theory on this also is that when you see a real narcissist, someone you could call that, someone who's dangerous or a form of a narcissist, their narcissism, their particular form of narcissism, which will be slightly different for each person, that's their form of idolatry. That is going to be whatever their form of idolatry is. If you're caught up with a person that is so into themselves and their lust, their pleasure, their lifestyle choices, their view of the world, and so forth, that and this is a real key identification method I'm about to give you. If they're so caught up in their way of seeing something or their way of doing a lifestyle habit and etc., their addictions, their needs, what I just listed, that they have no regard for God's ways and God's laws, and they have no regard for other people when it comes to that. Like if a person's extremely racist, or if they are extremely addicted to pornography or alcohol or drugs and they'll excuse it to the very last bit. I don't care how nice, these people can seem very, very nice. They can seem very good and very nice in a lot of ways. But when they are sold out in these areas and there's no coming back and they're not flexible and they don't acknowledge God, then they are caught in their form of idolatry. And to some degree or other, to one degree or other, it may just be a small shade, but in one degree or other, you are dealing with a narcissist. That is what a narcissist is. They are sold out to something that is not. And the thing is, it can be so hard for psychologists or people that are being abused to be able to nail it down or give it a good definition. But this is one of the best definitions I believe you can have. People can still hide a lot and they can still fool you. But if you can ever find this out, it can help you a lot because they're totally given over to themselves and their idea of things and the things that will control them. They're given over to things that will control them and lead them no telling where, versus trying to give themselves over to God. Even people who try to give themselves to God may have a lot of problems. But when you have somebody who has no regard for God and they mock that, then you're asking for trouble. These people are worshiping their idol. They're worshiping falseness. Psychology may call it a false ego. It's a false reality. They may worship celebrities, this idea of themselves, or a pet fantasy. You may never hear about it or see it specifically. But this is why psychologists will give the definition of one of the main definitions of a narcissist is that they will be preoccupied with a fantasy of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or an ideal such as love. They'll have this preoccupation with this fantasy. And I can tell you right now, this is not a fantasy of a TV show that they're sitting back and watching that someone else has success, power, brilliance, beauty. They're having fantasies of themselves having unlimited beauty and brilliance and power. That's what catches their mind. And where the spiritual comes in with this is the mind, imagery, imaginations, the third eye, the manifestation, all of these types of things. If you ever study the third eye, which you can get off into a lot of strange stuff with that, but even with Christians, the study there is that our third eye is our communication with God. That's our prayer life. That's where a lot of our prayer life is, and our communication with God. And so people that try to open their third eye, they have communication with demons and devils. And that's something I would warn against for obvious reasons. But if you think about the mind, imagery, your thought life is so important when it comes to spiritual communication. So I believe that the combination of fantasy, this type of fantasy that the psychologists have picked up on, the fantasy and the idolatry, which is sin, which opens the door to the devil, and all of the darkness that these people practice, I believe that this opens them up to the spiritual world and to the demonic attachments. And once that happens, which is probably at a very young age, and whenever it's enhanced by music and movies and chemicals such as the alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and pornography, when you start adding all of these things together with the fantasy life, and some people may call that being high on life and all this and give it a good connotation, but that's where I believe you start this cycle of giving yourself over to evil and evil taking over your mind. And that's what makes all of this narcissist thing worse and worse and worse. In a lot of people, this type of narcissist cycle does not show up in any other way that society recognizes other than what people call addictions. Usually it's not really recognized. One or two people may recognize it in their personal relationships and they may skate with everybody else. And that's why a lot of times an abused victim will be so frustrated because nobody else can see it, because there's such a no judge mentality and everyone's in such spiritual lack of teaching, lack of knowledge, don't know how to see these things, that A lot of the narcissism flies under everybody's radar, and the victim's the only one that will the victim of narcissism is the only one who gets abused, and then they'll get really frustrated because nobody else can see what they just saw. For example, like one of my main narcissist attacks was in church. When people are supposed to be seeing that, a lot of people in church can't see it either. They're blind also. The person can be flaunting all types of evil in their face, and they never pick up on it because they're living in evil themselves. And everyone thinks they're okay because they're up in church all the time doing specific things. So that's another form of it. But a lot of times people don't realize, they don't see the sign of this cycle of the devil having someone's mind and taking it over. They don't see it until it becomes an addiction that interferes with lifestyle. And then the world calls it addiction. And I've heard Ross Rosenberg explain that addictions are by nature they make a person very narcissistic. But that's kind of like, which definition are we giving the disorder at this point? But my idea of it is to look at it a little wider spectrum of the person gets caught up in these traps, and it makes them very addicted to their narcissism. It makes them an addict and a narcissist. But a lot of times it won't show up by society or be defined or anything else until it's an addiction, a chemical addiction. One of the descriptions I like to refer, there's a lot of descriptions of this in the New Testament, but I like Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, that describes this type of process of a person being caught up in their mind and in their flesh. It's together, getting caught up into this evil. And at the same time, it's being identified with a power, a dark power. It says a power of the air, but it's talking about these evil forces that work with people and to seduce them and to condemn them. So it says, "And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sin, wherein in time past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others." And so he's talking to people that are now saved and explaining that back before they were saved and they were in the world and they were lost, they were not being renewed by God and walking in the Spirit of God, that it says, according to the prince of the power of the air, that is the enemy of our soul. That's the evil forces of the world at work. And it also says you walked according to the course of this world and the spirit that works in the children of disobedience. And when it talks about children of wrath, these are the people going to hell, the wrath of God. And so if you're walking around fulfilling all the desires of your flesh and your mind and whatever comes to mind, and just, a lot of people think this is just acceptable and okay, and you're judging if you say it's not. But this is how the narcissist is formed and made, and how they're being attached to and influenced by the demon spirits. And so this is just a known spiritual warfare thing of how people get caught up and what happens to them. And if you keep reading, of course, it explains, like in verse 5, even when we were dead in sins, he hath quickened us together with Christ. By grace are you saved. And this grace is the power over sin, the power to overcome sin by walking with the Lord. And it's explaining that when you walk like this, you're dead in sins. And that's part of where they get their non-flexibility and their shallow, flat, simple thinking, and they can't see reality and they can't see the bigger picture of the world. That's part of being dead in sins. There's a lot more to it. For example, if they did pass from this life, they would go into damnation. That's death also. But the answer, of course, is being quickened with God. Only God can do that through salvation. But back to, I just like to use that Bible verse. There's so many like it. It was hard to pick one. That's a good Bible verse to explain just fulfilling the flesh, fulfilling all the time your mind and your flesh. This is that fantasy thing, the fantasy problem, the addictions, and that being directly connected to the demon powers that try to control people's mind. So when this process is going on, this leads to many types and kinds of abuse, darkness, and cruelty, as you well know if you've been a victim. And if you have not been saved yourself, but if you have been a victim of these type of people, you may be thinking, well, I'm not the same as them, but I'm not with Christ either. And if you consider yourself the empath and the kind person, and you don't give yourself to addictions, and you do care and you have kindness toward people, then this is probably God talking to you in your life about the difference, that there really is a hell, there really is a heaven, there really is salvation, there really are dark evil spirits, and that's what you have encountered. You have, as some people say, you have peeked through the veil. When the evil came and visited your life, that was your peek through the veil to the other side of what's really going on behind this digital world we're walking in, this little hologram that we're in right now, because there's a whole other spiritual world going on that is much bigger than what we can see with our eyes. So if you haven't been saved through Jesus yet, and but you're saying, but I'm not like the narcissist, I'm not like them. Well, maybe God's knocking on the door of your heart and calling you to Him and saying, you're one of mine, you need to come with me because you don't belong with this kind of evil. Because these kind of connection with devils and giving their mind over to devils like this, it leads to the many kinds of abuse. It leads to evil manifestations. And this depends on whatever kind of demon or demons are attached to the person. It may seem like they have like these personality switches, and it may be that wouldn't be like alternate personalities or demons coming in and out, as much as it would be how their personality reacts under the influence of different spirits that they have invited. So their addiction to all of this, it leads them into bondage and cruelty, and it explains their extreme highs and their extreme lows. Some people have made very interesting videos about how these people don't seem to need sleep. And you know how I've made videos about a person needing to be high all the time or keeping themselves in a high state even without drugs. And my theory there is that the spirit world gives them a super high. And an extreme of this would be like the arsonist. If you want to go to the extreme to get a good picture of it, a stereotype of it, it would be the arsonist who will watch a flame. He will literally put his career and everything else at risk, or she would go out and light a fire and watch it burn because of the severe high that it gives them, the extreme thrill that another person would never get. And this is a spiritual thing, I believe, where the demons can release whenever someone gives their mind over to their brain, their literal brain, their body, their mind, and their spirit over to something. I believe they can experience extreme highs and extreme lows. And this may be part of what you have witnessed. So while a devil has progressively taken someone's mind, that's where you see that they're not flexible, they're addicted, they're simple, flat, shallow, and non-realistic thinking. They are fantasy driven. Their emotions are out of control, and their fantasies are controlled by devils. That's what I believe. I believe that's the crux of the devil's got their mind. I believe they're in one fantasy, and the devil just keeps feeding them fantasy after fantasy after fantasy. And that's how they live. And like I said, their emotions are out of control, but it may appear otherwise. Like they may appear very stoic at times. They may can give you a silent treatment for days and days, and they're not concerned at all by the weird awkwardness of it. But that's because they're off somewhere with the devil during those times. They're controlled by devils. Their emotions are controlled by demons very tightly, I believe. And which means that if you're close to them, they're being led into all sorts of evils, foolish daydreams, harming other people, and they're being led around basically by the nose. Whatever these devils have in mind for them, if they get bored or whatever. And of course, you're the victim of it. I mean, the devils there are there to harm people, and if you're close to them, that probably means you're on the menu. And so that way you cannot be surprised when that happens. One of the theories that kind of leads into this that I thought about is that you'll hear people say in some of the psychological studies that if a person has an extremely damaging event that happens in their life as a child, that they will be kind of stunted at that age. I think it may be called arrested development, but they'll be stunted at an age emotionally and mentally from the time that they were abused. Well, I've also heard this theory that other things that can stunt them at a certain time is, say, like when they started watching pornography. If somebody started becoming addicted to pornography when they were 11, they'll be 11-year-old for the rest of their life. Or if they started smoking weed. And it can probably be other drugs, but weed is one that I've heard of, and everybody's like, oh, it's wonderful, it has medicine purposes, and it's not as dangerous as alcohol. Okay, my theory on that is if it can be used for medicine, let's use it only for medicine. We don't have to smoke weed, worship the devil, get high, and talk against Christ. We can just use it for the straight medicine purpose. We can give it to people with cancer if it supposedly cures all cancers. We can give it to people with Parkinson. But there is a problem with being a dope smoker and just being a weed smoker. And it's a problem that you'll never hear argued against, of course, in the layman. But then you'll hear all these problems with narcissism this and narcissism that, and where did it come from? But don't talk about weed smoking, though. See, it's like you got to look at all the aspects of reality here. But when someone starts smoking weed, say when they're 14 or when they're 15, that's the age. If they don't stop, that is the age they will be for the rest of their life. That's a known thing. So I would argue that a person is also probably stunted when they start picking up this rich fantasy world where they have the unlimited power, unlimited success, unlimited fame, unlimited whatever it is that they're addicted to, the devil's got them addicted to in their mind over and over. That's probably like if they start that and if they start really getting into this fantasy world, let's say when they're 13 and they never come out, they're always going to be a 13-year-old. And that's some of what you're looking at with the narcissist. That's just part of the problem. And these addictions that will stunt a person, the fantasies, the chemicals, the pornography, may or may not coincide with the time of abuse, because a lot of times an abuse will trigger a person into going into a fantasy or an escape. So that's part of it also. It may also be a form of neglect that causes a person to fantasize or escape through drugs. And there's a lot of neglect and abuse that goes on in our world that we consider normal. And like one of the neglects is not having a home life, both parents all the time gone working, and sitting the child in front of a television for all the time. And a lot of forms of neglect and abuse are just accepted as normal. And there's something to keep in mind, because I know everything can't be perfect. We can't control everything all the time, but to just get some answers. And of course, some of the problem with a fantasy world, or as I say, giving the devil their mind, it may just be the natural fallen nature of a person outside of salvation. You can't really point to any part of their life that was neglect, abuse, trauma, or an addiction to something that opened them up to darkness. It could just be the fallen nature. So this is one more thing you can consider if you know a narcissist, if you've had contact with a narcissist that seems to be constantly driven and controlled and consumed by dark influences. That's something to think about. This could very well be what's going on. And like I say, I've only met a handful of people, like I would say maybe a dozen through all my life, traveling a lot of different places, doing a lot of different things that I just knew, like, wow, the devil's got their mind. That kind of narcissism. I've seen a lot of different other kinds of narcissism, and it usually had to do with the addiction and the fantasy based and thinking very highly of themselves or idealizing themselves into a non reality for addiction purposes. But sometimes I'll meet a particular person where my first instinct of them is the devil's got their mind, and that's kind of rare. But I gave you the extreme example so you could kind of understand the principle of what was going on. And especially if there's other open doors in that person's life, the common ones are pornography, drugs, and alcohol, rage, anger. Could probably give a lot to that list. But that right there, fornication, sleeping around, those are big open doors that they are inviting evil, dark things in, and nobody puts a finger on those things anymore and calls them out. So therefore, a lot of people can't see what's going on. They cannot see the darkness that's being invited in, and that may be another red flag that you can add to your list of a person that's inviting darkness in to control their mind. And so that's what I have for narcissists. The devil's got their mind. So watch out if you meet people like this. Maybe it'll give you a better idea of what you're actually witnessing and seeing. I hope it helps you. Please share it if you think it's interesting, if you know of somebody who can be helped by it, and leave your comments if you want. And stay tuned for more videos on narcissists. I'm going to try to make a few more of those from time to time. And God bless you on your healing journey, and stay tuned.